Thank you, everyone. Hello, it's Rod Austin, the club manager of Hobson's Bay Yacht Club. We're here for our very first webinar. It's a little bit different than a normal Zoom meeting, as it's a webinar in regards to you'll only be able to see the panelists, but we can see that you're there and we're very happy to have you there. We're very fortunate to have a very special guest speaker in being Doug King. But I firstly just want to welcome you to The Dirty Dozen by Doug King. And I want to introduce you my co-MC tonight being Suzanne Walshe. I hope everything's fairly relaxed. We do encourage you to use the chat button to ask any questions. That's probably the best way that we'll gauge what you'd like to hear from Doug. But I find Doug's topic and the heading of this webinar really interesting. I don't know what it is, but I'm sure we're looking forward to hearing all about it. So Suzanne, I'm going to introduce you now. Suzanne Walshe is a new member of our club that has got heavily involved and is on currently our working group in regards to membership and marketing, which is fabulous. She also helped on the Bushfire Appeal Night, and she also offered to be my support tonight, being the very first webinar. So Suzanne, if you'd like to introduce Doug, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rod. It's my absolute pleasure. And as Rod mentioned, we've got Doug here, who I understand on good authority is actually the guru of marine safety in Victoria.
Hardly.
And so the format for this evening is going to be Doug is going to enlighten us with some very interesting information that will be very relevant to club members. And we're anticipating it'll be about the first 30 minutes, and then there will be time for questions. So there is the chat function there so that you can just put your questions in. I'll be monitoring the chat and feeding those questions through to Doug later. So a little about Doug. So the topic, The Dirty Dozen, how human factors influence boating, good and bad. Doug is very well qualified to talk about this. From his early boating holidays on the Gippsland Lakes, Doug's love of boating has never waned. Obtaining a master's certificate in 1981, he's been on the water as a professional seafarer and recreational boater since. Doug's experience includes 11 years at the Victorian Water Police, 25 years as Yachting Victoria Powerboat Training Coordinator, and 10 years with Port Phillip Sea Pilots as a launch coxswain. As a senior Yachting Australia instructor, he has conducted power and safety boat courses continuously since 1990 and has worked with Maritime Safety Victoria and the Australian Maritime Safety Authority in the safety field. In 2014, he authored The Boating Survival Guide, published by Hardy Grant Publications, and writes the Waterwise column in the Club Marine magazine, and has had a regular safety segment on the lifestyle program River to Reef. Doug's recreational boating has seen him undertake vessel deliveries across the eastern seaboard and power cruising in Queensland, South Australia, and New South Wales, and of course Victoria. Doug swallowed the anchor in 2018, and he's now currently ashore, employed by Emergency Management Victoria as their Marine Search and Rescue Training Officer. Doug, welcome, and thank you so much for bringing all your experience to us tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne, and thanks, Rod. And they say that safety doesn't sell, so that's why I've called this The Dirty Dozen and Human Factors, just to pique a little bit of interest. But there's some really important things that I want to talk about tonight that perhaps you may not think about when you're boating or sailing. And there'll be a couple of confronting things in there as well, which I'd like you to think about and reflect on. I've known Rod for a long time, and I think we first met when you were down at Sorrento, Rod.
Year 2000 it was, so 20 years ago.
Yeah, so Rod's been kicking around on the water for a long time as well. Many of you may very well have heard of human factors or know about what they are, and particularly if you work in the transport, aviation, or medical field, or the railway field. And essentially, human factors are how we as people interact with machinery and interact with tasks involving machinery, transport, those sorts of things, and particularly important in sailing and boating on the water. Two landmark studies looked at this, one done in the early 2000s by Marine Safety Victoria. And it showed that human factors accounted for almost 65% of incidents on the water that involved either admission to hospital as a result of injury or death. And in the commercial field, Australian Maritime Safety Authority, they say that about 70% of all incidents involve some sort of breakdown of human factors. And what are human factors, and what's the dirty dozen? Well, the dirty dozen is essentially 12 key points around various things that you do or don't do that can affect your safety. That's at one end of the spectrum, and at the lower end of the spectrum can affect your enjoyment on the water, can just merely spoil your day. So let's have a look at those 12. Now I'll see if I can get these up on the screen for you, and we'll just go through them. So are you able to see that?
We will be, yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I'll just go through point by point, and I'll expand on them, and we'll talk about a couple of examples as well. So the first issue that is a precursor to accidents or incidents is lack of communication. Now let's have a think about that on board a vessel on the water, and particularly when you're sailing. And I haven't done a lot of keelboat sailing. I certainly have done a bit of keelboat sailing, particularly on a boat out of Williamstown called Makani, a Jeanneau, and that was up in the Whitsundays. But also did a fair bit of sailing in smaller off-the-beach boats that I had when my children were younger. But when you think about on larger boats, particularly keel boats, where you do have to communicate with people to get things done, it's whether you're tacking, whether you're coming about, it's whether you're raising or lowering sails, poor communication is at the top of contributing causal factors in accident reports. So it's important to think about how you do communicate on board, and complex messages should be written down, and use checklists, logbooks, worksheets, those sorts of things, particularly in planning stages. So if you're planning a cruising trip, or you're in a race, let's say you're doing the Stanley race, or you're going down to Polar Bay or the Port Fairy race, communication starts with writing things down, having checklists, and then when you're communicating on board, keep any verbal messages short and emphasize the most critical elements, and at the beginning and at the end, and avoid assumptions, and also give people opportunities to ask questions. Now, I'd invite people watching to just think about whether or not they've actually worked under a skipper on a boat or been sailing on a boat who is not a very good communicator, and reflect on how that can occur. Complacency is the second of the dozen, and it's described as a feeling of self-satisfaction accompanied by loss of awareness. Now, here's an interesting word, awareness. And we're going to talk about situational awareness in a bit more detail in a moment, because it in many ways is the key of safety on the water, but it's also the key around human factors. Complacency is not because you're lazy. It's not because you don't want to do something. Quite often, it's a routine activity that's become habitual, which can then lead to important signals being missed, and it's sometimes seeing what you expect to see. And I'm sure you've all experienced this, where you expect to see something or something to happen because that's what usually happens, and bang, it doesn't. Lack of knowledge may very well seem a bit of a no-brainer, but it can lead to misjudging situations and making unsafe decisions. So decision-making is a separate topic in itself, but it does rely on knowledge. And it's important that you continually train and keep yourself up to date. And if you are experienced, that you share any knowledge that you have with your crew members and your peers, because that will help build safety. Distractions. Distractions are the #1 cause of forgetting things, and the need to be aware of where you are and what you're doing is really important. Now, one of the things about distractions are that humans tend to think ahead. So as a result of that, if you're distracted, when you come back to the task, generally people will think they are further ahead in that task to where they actually are. So it's really important on the water that you compartmentalize things so that you don't get distracted. And again, you come back now to communication. So this is where checklists and having an actual list of things, whether not necessarily written down, but where you have a list of things that you do in order, and make sure that you follow those. And it's quite a good idea if you are distracted by something. It could be a radio call, it could be an incident on the boat, particularly if you're in a race. When you come back to what you were doing, try and consciously come back a couple of steps so that you don't automatically fall into that, I'm further ahead than I thought I was. Lack of teamwork. So if you're racing, of course, teamwork's extremely important. But teamwork skills take a little bit. It's easier to say we work as a team, and lots of people have done teamwork exercises and things. But if one person doesn't contribute to a team effort, it can lead to unsafe outcomes or undesirable ones, such as losing a race. Some of the teamwork skills that include leadership, fellowship, effective communication. So we come back to #1 on the dirty dozen, trust building, and praise giving. Now, I've done a little bit of racing under skippers, and praise giving under one particular skipper I sailed under was not something he'd ever heard of. It was generally the other way. Fatigue is, I just want to talk about, there's one point I want to make about teamwork. Don't look at teamwork, and I've just talked about it in the context of it being on your boat. Have a look at your team as being a little wider than that. So members of your team might be Roger Penfold, who does your mechanical work. It could be your sailmaker. It could be your rigger. It could be the person who is keeping an eye open for you, or a safety watch while you're out sailing. And they're all members of your team. And something that's very close to you at Williamstown, where teamwork fell down badly, was the incident up at Pier 35, where the 2 people lost their life in a boat explosion. And their reliance there, when you read the coroner's report, they relied upon certain people servicing the boat and doing things, and assumed that they were done, and they weren't. And that led to a number of things occurring, which ended up in an explosion on the boat. So don't look at teamwork as just the people on your boat or your crew. Very important part of your team is your club and the people in your club, the experienced people in your club. So then you come back to that, one of those dirty dozens, lack of knowledge. You've got really experienced and knowledgeable people at your club. Use them, and they can be part of your team as well. The next one, list on the Dirty Dozen is fatigue. Fatigue is insidious, and I found a couple of times that I succumbed to fatigue working for the pilots, and they had an extremely good fatigue management program. However, how often have you been out, let's say on a race, and you're coming back, the weather's bad, you're wet, you're cold, you've been up for a long time, and suddenly you don't really understand or can remember exactly how you got from point A to point B, but you got there, but you can't remember the things that happened along the way. Be very, very careful of fatigue because it affects your ability to concentrate, which then has a downflow effect on you making good decisions. Once you're fatigued, you can be distracted easily and situational awareness can be lost. I just want to talk a little bit on fatigue about an incident that occurred in 2009, which you may or may not know about, and it involved the Cruising Yacht Club in Sydney, and it was their race down to Port Kembla and around Flinders Islet, and an 80-foot yacht. I think it had 18 people on board. It was called PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers. They ran aground on Flinders Islet, and with the loss of their skipper and their forward hand, Sally Gordon. And when you read the report about that, and the report was done by a retired naval admiral, when you read the report, the skipper, who was highly experienced, had worked all day, had got onto the boat at around about 7 p.m. in the evening, and had navigated, steered the boat, and I'll just look at the report here. The skipper always sailed, was the principal helmsman, tactician, and navigator. And so it was in the early hours of the morning, where they were had been slogging into a southerly wind out of Sydney Heads and down towards Port Kembla, and they were going to round the island on a port tack, so they were heading southwest on a port tack, and they ran into the northern edge of Flinders Islet, and the boat grounded, and eventually the boat was lost, as well as the 2 lives. And have a think about fatigue there. Now, it's not known exactly what happened, but there the skipper, he'd been doing 4 jobs on board, 4 really hard jobs, and he'd been up all day. Got onto the boat at 8 p.m, 6 hours later, they've run aground. So there's at least, let's say, up working 8 hours, 8 and 6, there's 14 hours non-stop, in the last 6 of them in an environment in heavy seas, in rough seas, sailing a yacht and working out tactics in a yacht race. That wasn't the only thing that happened there. So be really aware of fatigue. It's a really important thing that you should be looking at and understanding about, and share the load. The next thing we'll have a look at is pressure. Pressure can be expected when you're in a dynamic environment, and it can be created by lack of resources, and by lack of resources, especially lack of time. This ends up in poor judgments. Now, with pressure, learn assertiveness skills of being able to say no and stop, and communicate well with your colleagues. The important thing about pressure on the water is to remember that time gives you options. So if you make time, you will reduce pressure. So making time for yourself, again, particularly in racing, is by planning ahead. It's communicating, it's having teamwork, so you don't have to do all the jobs yourself. It comes back then to training. So let's have a look at lack of assertiveness. You should be able to, on board a boat, you should be able to express concerns and allow others to express their concerns as well. And it's important that speaking one's mind assertively is not about aggression. It's about communicating directly. So there should be within the team an understanding that you can express yourself, and you're expected to speak up if you think there is something you're not comfortable with, and not be made out to be a fool if it's nothing at all. And again, this comes down to teamwork, it comes down to good communications. The important thing about assertiveness on board a boat is that criticism should be directed at actions and their consequences and not at people. And that's important. Moving down the dozen, stress. I'm not talking about being stressed out, and most of us are at the moment. With stress, I'm talking more about where time demands are placed on you and you don't have time to deal with them. And that's called acute stress. Acute stress shortens the time frame that you have to make decisions, to concentrate on things, and to assess situations. When that happens, you have impaired or delayed decision making, and there is a higher likelihood of you zoning out. In other words, forgetting about the big picture and just zoning in on what's happening in front of you. So with stress, I'll go back again and talk about time gives you options. So in everything that you do, give yourself time. I'm not sure if you've ever experienced working or being on board with someone, they don't give you enough time to get lines and fenders ready when you're coming alongside. They don't plan out what you're going to do. They don't communicate how they're going to do it. And suddenly you've got a pier coming up alongside you. You might have a wind or a tide that's affecting the boat. People start yelling. Poor decisions are made. You don't have time to get things done. Stress. Plan ahead. Give yourself time, and that will help alleviate that acute stress. Chronic stress, we won't go into that, but it's accumulated from the results of long-term life demands, and that's more of a physical thing rather than a situational thing. Situational awareness, I could talk about this all night. Lack of situational awareness results from other human factors. So I've talked about it: stress, fatigue, pressure, poor decisions and distraction, and reliance on electronic navigation, etc., can create lack of situational awareness. Now, situational awareness is three things. First of all, in any situation, it is the perception of what's happening. So that perception, it would be what's going on. Let's say we're sailing down the bay. Where are we going? What's happening? How fast are we going? Where are we going to be in 6 minutes time, in 30 minutes time, in an hour's time? And that's the way you should be thinking when you're sailing. And then you should be checking against that. You know, are we where we thought we were going to be, etc., etc. What traffic is there around? What's happening with the sails? If you've got an engine, how's the engine running? What gear are we in? What heading are we on? And so on. Once you can perceive all that, you can put that together, and situational awareness then brings in comprehension. So once you've got those things, you've got to be able to comprehend what they mean. What do they actually mean about your operation and what we're doing and where we're going? And when you are able to understand that, that allows you then to predict. And good situational awareness allows you to predict what's going to happen with certainty, or with a degree of certainty. I always use the example of a good AFL footballer who always knows where the ball is going to be. It's not because they're talented just on their own. It's because they watch the game. They understand where the game plan might be going, how the ball's going to come down to them, where the ball might go. That's good situational awareness. And that's extremely important. And when you look at PricewaterhouseCoopers at Flinders Islet, they were, according to the report, navigating by global positioning system. And the report says that that's what all they were using. And the course on the GPS indicated to them that they were going to pass north of the island, when in fact they ran onto the island. Just a quick word about GPS, and I'm sure you've got experts that can probably talk to you about on another night about this, Rob. In this case, there were 7 satellites available. So you look at your machine and you see, oh, well, there's 7 satellites, we must be getting a good position. In fact, only 2 were really usable because of their angle above the horizon. And this created what's called a dilution of position, which is quite common with GPS. And so when they reverse engineered and looked at the GPS system, it was quite clearly somewhere between 100 and 150 metres in error on the position. So the point about situational awareness I want to make around electronic navigation is don't use it solely. To use GPS and chart plotters, you must have a good understanding of manual navigation and have some cross checks against it. And that will help your navigational situational awareness and keep you safe. I won't go any further because we're a little bit short on time, but there are some really key points about using electronic navigation that you should be thinking about. And the major overall point about that is that you should be using other means of fixing your position to ensure and cross-check that the machine is telling you the right thing. That's really, really important. We'll have a look at norms. Boating practices develop over time through experience, often under the influence of a specific culture. These can be good, they can be bad, they can be unsafe. Sometimes they're referred to as the things that we do, that's the way we do things. Unfortunately, norms can follow unwritten rules or behaviours which deviate from required rules and instructions. Now, everywhere has rules. The reason for rules generally is that they've been designed and tested, and they should be followed because they've been designed and tested. So if you have a think about some of the rules just that you have out on the water. 05, speed limits, wearing PFDs. All of these things make sense, but they're there because people have deviated from them in the past and or enough people have deviated to create a problem to say, well, we need to have some rules around them, and the norm is not to go on the water while you've been affected by alcohol, and so on. So be aware of peer pressure and force of habit. We always do it this way, and that's the way that it's going to be done, because norms have not been designed to meet all circumstances and therefore are not adequately tested against potential threats. That's the dirty dozen. In fact, in human factors, there are a whole range of other things that make up human factors: decision-making, safety culture or safety behaviour, where you follow up safety breaches and work out why they happen and what they mean to you and how you can do things differently in the future. Alcohol and drugs are part of the human factors, but the dirty dozen are the important ones. And just to recap on those, I'll run through just very quickly. I hope this doesn't make your eyes go up. Good communications is important. Don't be complacent where you follow routine activities and becoming habits, using habitual things, because you may miss important safety signals. Build knowledge. If you have knowledge, share it. Beware of distractions, and remember that if you're distracted from something, that you may very well come back to the task that you were doing and think that you are further ahead than you really are. If you're distracted, take a step back, work through it again. Work on teamwork. Give everybody an opportunity to work in a team and have roles for people on board. Listen to them, allow them to speak up. Be aware of fatigue, extremely important. Lack of resources. I think I might have skipped over that one. Resources, essentially the time. I think I talked about time being a resource. Remember that time will give you options. It's an important resource to have. Pressure, operating in a dynamic pressure. Just be aware that under pressure, poor judgments can be made. Lack of assertiveness, speak up, allow others to speak up, and develop a culture where being able to speak up about concerns is not seen as a bad thing, but is a good thing and can quite often be a learning experience. Stress. Remember, the biggest stress is rushing. As you rush, do things more quickly, you place stress on yourself. Again, lose time, lose options, poor decisions, poor assessment of situations. Situational awareness, extremely important. Don't be focused on one thing. Look at the whole picture. Build up a perception of what's happening. Comprehend what is happening, and you will find, and you'll see this in good people on the water, that they predict what's going to happen. It's not by good luck. It's by skill, discipline, knowledge, etc. And be aware of norms. Don't necessarily follow cultures that say, oh, it's just the way that we've always done this. If there are procedures to do things safely, follow them and do them. So, Rod, that's the dirty dozen.
Thank you.
They are important. They are identified as being key factors where incidents do occur and serious incidents occur. And I'll just finish up by saying, think about the human factors in this incident in 2007, where two people who were members of a boating syndicate, fairly inexperienced, took a boat out of the Brisbane River to go fishing over in Stradbroke Island. They came back at night, at speed, on a GPS. The GPS had out-of-date chart card on it, and ran onto an area that was being reclaimed. One person died, and as the boat hit the rocks. They were travelling at night at 20 knots. Have a think of the human factors involved in that incident and what may have been done differently. They passed a number of navigation beacons that warned people of where the safe water was as a result of this land reclamation being occurring. And it's tragic because the dirty dozen came into play in a number of factors. It's not a movie. They're real things. Watch out for them.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you. I think we can't really give you a round of applause unless I know how to turn everyone on. This is our first webinar, Doug, so I believe I can turn people on if they'd like to ask a question, or they can go on the chat. Just that, Doug, well, first of all, I'm never going to watch The Dirty Dozen again and not think you're Lee Marvin now, so thank you.
No, that's okay.
And it was a bit of a Hollywood touch with the good and bad and the ugly, but it is really good to remind me. And out of those 12 factors, I probably have I think all of us probably have a story to tell. I mean, I just in regards to some of mine was off Cape Woolamai, where I thought everything was safe, home and hose, coming home from, I think we were just coming from Port Albert that day, but we just died of wind, and then we turned on the engine and the engine didn't work, and we were way too close to Cape Woolamai, and it came came to fruition that, you know, the closest boat to come and help us out was over an hour and a half away. So from Hastings. So it was, you know, unless a little bit of wind came, we were in a bit of strife. So you've got to remember things like that. Can I
mention just one thing that came out of there? It's quite striking. Is there's a fellow called Professor James Reason, who has put together what he called the Swiss cheese model. And if you've done risk assessment or risk management courses, you've probably seen the Swiss cheese model. But what it talks about is if you put layers of Swiss cheese together, when the holes line up, and failures will go through and something will happen. And effectively what it means is that if you have more than one thing go wrong, you're starting on a slippery slope to disaster, and you've got to have something to stop it. So just from what you've told me, there's three things happened there that would, after the third thing happened, I'd be going, So first of all, you're off Cape Woolamai, the water's pretty deep, you can't anchor. Got no wind, one problem. Second problem, engine won't start. Third problem, you're reasonably close to shore, and it's a pretty gnarly shoreline there on the southern end of Phillip Island. So you've got three issues there that start to line up. So it's always a good idea when you're boating, if one thing goes wrong, followed by something else, and it doesn't have to be physically go wrong, it could be where you are, antenna should go up and say, okay, we need to sort this out and work it out. But yeah, everybody will have a story, and when you go back and think about what I've spoken to you about, I'm sure everybody has an example of one or two of those things that have occurred to them.
Suzanne, I noticed there's a couple of chats to the panellists. Do you just mention those, Suzanne?
Yes, so there was a thank you from Colin Leake, and well, that was the main thing. We are going to...
there's a couple from Tony Dawson there as well.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, sure. I think everyone can see those.
No, I don't think they can. Can they all see them?
Can you? Oh, okay.
I can see them, Susan.
All right. Okay.
Suzanne, yeah.
I might just try something. Tony, you're listening to us, but I'm going to put your speaker on so you're allowed to talk, Tony. And I just want to get some reference to say, how's this webinar going? Can you hear us? Can you talk, Tony?
Take yourself off mute, Tony.
You there?
Okay, no problems.
Yep.
How are you, Tony?
Look, I'm fine, Doug. You've done a great talk again. You're just fantastic. I think all.
I don't know about that, but thank you.
No, look. I've been doing yacht club stuff for 40 years, and all this stuff is exactly what needs to be emphasised to everybody. That's just fantastic, Doug. Thanks for all that. And the last thing I said was that I spoke to a tugboat skipper a long time ago, and he said he'd been doing it for 20 years and was getting a bit, get a bit complacent. He'd done it a lot of times, and he thought he was a bit concerned because he was starting to lose his edge. Was getting a little bit too familiar.
Yep.
And he was, he was a bit concerned about it, which was good. It indicates what's going on.
I won't use up time, Rod, but I had a situation getting a pilot off a ship just down in the Williamstown anchorage, where everything lined up, and ended up me damaging the boat and nearly going underneath the car carrier. And I got a fright, and I thought I was pretty good at driving boats, and just these things snuck up on me, and when I look back on it, it was all about fatigue. I'd been called out because the car carrier was unable to berth, so it had to go to anchor. I'd come home, I'd been asleep for 2 hours after a long day, and I had to go back out again. So they're good points, Tony. I noticed that you say there, air crash investigation is really instructive. Human factors is huge in the aviation industry. It's huge.
Yeah, and air crash investigations as a program just shows how a small series of incidents over a period of time just build up and build up and build up until there's a catastrophe. On their own, each are insignificant, but together they're just disastrous.
There's a very interesting case if people want to have a look at it and Google it. It's called Eastern Airlines Flight 401. It crashed in Miami, I think, in '89. The reason it crashed was a $2 light bulb, where people go and have a look at it on the web. Disregard the ghost stories. Try and find the report and read about it, and you'll see how everything just lined up. Generally, the dirty dozen, and ended up in a jumbo jet crashing.
Yeah. It happens a lot, and air crash investigation stuff is really good at picking up the human factors and minor things happening and develop into a major catastrophe.
Tony, I don't know something about privateer. It just, just laying a mark with a GPS.
Look, I was just when Doug was talking about GPS, I was anchored off R4 for a finish of a race. And for about 15 minutes, the GPS had us off Sandridge Beach doing 8 knots to the north for about 15 minutes. Eventually, it sorted itself out, but gee whiz, I've lost total trust in GPS after that.
Yeah, look, they're very, very good.
Yep.
But unfortunately, where we get people coming out of cars, we're using GPS to keep us on roads. There's not a big understanding about dilution of position or horizontal dilution of position with GPS satellites. So generally they can be very, very accurate. But the thing that surprised me when I saw that, Tony, there's no coffee shop over there.
Okay. Yeah. Well, what I came away from that incident was that nothing beats looking out the window.
Yeah, eyeball 101. You can't beat it. Yeah.
Yep.
Doug, I'm not a sailor and I don't know a lot about boating, but it just strikes me listening to you talking that what you're talking about are a number of things that you can do, but it's really around mindset and optimizing your performance. So how you can have a proactive approach to really make sure that you're going to be maintaining your awareness and focus, being really vigilant, just not making assumptions, being prepared for those unexpected things, so you're always on the front foot. So it just sounds to me like really putting yourself in the most optimal position to be making those judgments and decision making, which seem to me to be continuous. I've only been sailing a few times, but everything's changing all the time, and so it's like not leaving anything to chance and not assuming anything, and taking that very proactive approach and to really optimize your performance.
I think you're right, and it's a layered approach where you start off at the very pointy end. It's who's on your boat and how you work together. But as you broaden that out, it comes back out to how do your race officers manage and what do they expect from you, and how the sailing instructions, how are they worked? When you look at how's your overall safety plan around the race, and in the big picture, what's the culture of the club like? There's a whole lot of layers to it, but it is a very individual thing as well, as you say. The individuals have got to embrace this for the whole thing to work.
The culture and the communication in a lot of the studies they've done on crash, where there have been crashes, it's because someone hasn't questioned authority, or there's been groupthink, or there hasn't been a culture of people being able to speak up. And so the communication is really, really critical, and I see that in the different fields that I work in, and I imagine in sailing it would be even more critical.
I mentioned in the communications, just, I think the most important thing is before a race, the crew gather around the cockpit and just talk about what's going to happen in the next 2 hours, even if it's just a club race, to say, these are your roles, these are your responsibilities, you all know your duties, I'm here to help, all those type of things. That briefings are very important part for our club races anyway, just before you start a race. Yeah,
absolutely. Look, I think that's something that's fairly standard these days. but everything can always be improved upon. It's quite. I was involved with two others to do a review of Sandringham Yacht Club's safety procedures and safety manuals after the unfortunate death of the I forget the name of the boat in April about 18 months ago. It's quite interesting to see how Sandringham as a club openly embraced the need to review what they did and how they did it. And then not only once the review was completed and a number of findings were made, that the committee took those on board and followed them. And I think that's where overall where good culture starts. But it's also individuals calling out bad behaviours. So, very quite often norms and those sorts of things. Can I just, while I'm talking, can I say good evening to Ray Duncan? Good evening, Ray. Nice to see you sitting there on the side.
Hang on, I'll turn him on. Hello, Ray.
Oh, he's on mute.
I'm trying to take him off, but Ray, you no.
No, that's all right.
Yep. Now?
Yeah, we can hear you now, Ray.
Yeah. Hi, Rod. Thanks, Doug. Nice to hear you again. It was a great session. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ray.
So Ray, just if everyone doesn't know, Ray's a Williamstown local that's a member of our club, but he's a life member at Port Melbourne Yacht Club. So it's great to have Ray involved in these discussions. Yeah.
So we've got quite a few members here tonight. Just wondering now, questions for Doug?
On anything, if I can't answer it, I'll tell you I can't.
When I say questions, you probably need to just put on a chat, put it on the chat, so we can turn on your microphone. For interest's sake, those that are attending, I can see we've got some, our active members participating, but we very much think that this being our first webinar, that this is also how we're going to be hosting our AGM. So the better we have questions and answers, the better we'll be for our AGM, which is due in a month and a half's time. So it's good to see how things are going.
There's some nice feedback there from Lynn, Pat Caruso, Ray, just thanking you for your insights. And I don't know if you can see those there from Tony.
I can, thank you. And thank you to those people. I appreciate that.
Okay, lovely.
I want to wrap up, Doug, but before I do, we've got Doug King. We've got the two Kings, and we want it varied and very much at interest's sake. I'm going to.
Rod, you're frozen.
Oh, am I still there? Am I there?
Doug, do you want to just keep? Oh,
I'm there. So
okay.
I'm going to.
You froze there for a second, Rod.
Yeah, my internet connection is saying unstable, so I might not say too much. Okay, right. I was going to share a poster. We've got the two Kings this August, and they've both actually been in the police force. Doug being in the Water Police, and Russell King is currently a policeman, and he's going to be talking about tactical navigation and the Sydney to Hobart, where he's. And so very different to what Doug King's talking about tonight. So hopefully you'll continue. One of the things we're practicing and talking to Suzanne, why I wanted her to support, is that regards, this is a webinar when we also could have a meeting. So the webinar is essentially watching the panelists. If it's only, and I wouldn't mind experimenting, and we have some meetings as well with presentations. That's what you're used to, Doug, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
So we might even have we might even trial, and I'll ask Suzanne and a few others at the end of this meeting a bit of feedback in regards to whether a webinar or having it as a meeting where you can see everyone and they can interact a little bit more might be the way to go. So that'll be important. But Doug, like Doug said, I've known him for 20 years now. He probably didn't realise that, but 20 years. Yeah. He's well respected at all the yacht clubs that I've ever managed, and Sandringham Yacht Club, I know, have utilised you. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I found that was really important, that you're on many, many different safety panels. And I'd actually asked Doug, just prior to asking him to do this webinar, to host a powerboat handling course for us, for most of our race crew. and he kindly obliged as long as he had the time and place and he could do it. But all this is really Doug's hobby. It might be his career, but anything he does outside of work is his hobby, and we really appreciate when he has this. Usually at this time, I'd also be giving you a small gift and a token of appreciation. I haven't got someone standing behind you to give you a gift. Look, we've really appreciate being our very first webinar in a very difficult year, and like all those complimentary comments that you've had, I'd like to thank you very much on behalf of Hobsons Bay Yacht Club.
Thanks, Rod. It's a pleasure, and I like Hobos. I've run quite a few courses over there, and love the people, love the club, and it's an absolute pleasure. And I hope I know some people looking at the chats have said there's certainly been got some good things out of it. I hope those who haven't joined the chat and have just been watching, I hope that they've got some useful tips and information about it as well. I'll follow up, Rod, with you with just some written information via email, just to on those points that I've made for you, so that if people want them, that you can get them out to them.
Wonderful. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, Suzanne, is there any more?
No, I think just their comments, just again thanking.
Okay.
Yes, no questions, further questions.
And I'd like to thank Suzanne for coming on at the last minute. So I appreciate, because she's had a very busy day. And
absolute pleasure. Thank you. And thank you, Doug. It was really informative. I got a lot out of it.
Thanks, Suzanne. Nice to have met you.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you,
Sounds like you'll be owed a couple of pints of hobos when you come down to the club, when we can all get back down there again, Doug.
It'll be nice to do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for attending, everyone. Really appreciate it. Okay. See you.